This session, which has two speakers, is on the Bible and America's founding fathers, and we've had plenty of introduction to that already in our sessions last night and earlier today and this morning, in which we saw how the Bible has figured in various aspects of the political process and the cultural representations in this country. The topic itself swirls around some of the issues about whether or not the Bible was part of America's founding fathers and their views of what this country should be like in relationship to religion. Our first speaker, we're delighted to welcome to campus John Fia. He's associate professor and chair of the history department at Messiah College, and he's exceedingly well prepared to talk about this subject, about the recognition of the role of the Bible in our early American history. With a PhD in American history and 2 MAs, including one in church history, he has prepared himself well to talk about and to think about various topics in American history that deal with religion. One of John's books has received wide attention, one of his several books has received wide attention for its exploration of the complex issues surrounding the role of religion in American history. This is a book called Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? And you can all try to already think about how you might answer that question. It's an historical introduction to this topic, and it was a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize. John has been widely acclaimed. This book has been widely acclaimed as a must-read for both Christian nationalists and others, secularists. For he challenges the way both groups seek the past to buttress their arguments for the present. Another of his books, an edited book, is also worth mentioning in relationship to this conference. It's called Confessing History, Explorations in Christian Faith and the Historian's Vocation, which was also a finalist for an award. He's presently working on an important project called Presbyterian Rebellion, the American Revolution in the Mid-Atlantic. I guess we're the Mid-Atlantic, and we would need to know something about that here. John's reviews and essays have appeared in a wide variety of scholarly and popular venues, and he is a very active blogger and public speaker. We are delighted to have him here to contribute to the question, does America have a biblical heritage? John?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's always, not always the best slot, I guess, right after lunch. Right, everyone's getting sleepy, but we'll do our best to keep you awake this afternoon. It's good to be with you, good to be here. This is my first time on the Duke campus, so I'm thrilled to have been invited. Like everyone else, I thank the organizers for inviting me to talk about this topic. Usually when I go around speaking, and I usually go around and the title is, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation?, which happens to be the title of my book. Usually most people come to my lectures, and they're often public lectures at very, very different kinds of places. They normally come to the lecture with their mind already made up on the issue, and they're just looking for me to provide them with some kind of historical evidence to support their views. So we'll see how it goes today. But my assignment this afternoon, let me add one more thing. Serena asked me to make this announcement. I try to stay very active in terms of blogging and social media. I've been tweeting this conference. If anyone's interested in tweeting the conference, I've been working on the hashtag is, and for those of you who are Twitter sensitive, you know what I mean. The hashtag is Bible in Public Square. It's a little bit long, but it'd be great if we can get some conversation going throughout the rest of the day on Twitter. Anyway, having said that, my little social media pitch. My assignment today is a little bit different. than what I'm usually required to speak about, although it's sort of a sister question, right? Does America have a biblical heritage? Now, I should add that the title of my talk, it's not my own. This was the title I was given by the conference organizers. They told me, we would like you to give a talk on does the Bible or does America have a biblical heritage? So allow me, by way of introduction at least, to play with that title a little bit, maybe try to parse it out or deconstruct it a bit. Now, I am assuming in a session on the Bible and the American founding that the conference organizers wanted me to discuss the role the Bible played at the time of the founding and the coming of the American Revolution, perhaps the revolution itself or the immediate aftermath of the revolution. Perhaps they wanted to call upon a historian to provide a larger context to the fruitful conversations that we've been having thus far and that we will have, I assume. And that eventually is what I'll get around to do. I'll eventually do that here in a few minutes. But I was particularly struck in the title of the talk I was asked to give with the use of the word heritage. Historians don't use the term heritage very much. In fact, we don't really like that term. And I'll explain why here in a second. Those who sing the praises in our culture today of America's biblical heritage are really, in my opinion, talking more about the present than they are about the past. The purpose of heritage, writes historian David Lowenthal, is to domesticate the past so that it can be enlisted for present causes. It is a way of approaching the past that is fundamentally different than the discipline of history. Never thought you'd get a history lesson here, right? Heritage calls attention to the past to make a political point. It is rarely concerned with nuance or paradox. Lowenthal describes devotion to heritage as something akin to a spiritual calling. It is intricately wed to civil religion, nationalism, and a sense of feel-good collective identity. When it comes to the role of the Bible in the American past, one does not have to look very far to find the Heritage Crusaders who are out there. One prominent example, who I've had some experience with, is a man by the name of David Barton. Some of you may be familiar with this gentleman. One of America's foremost Christian nationalists and Heritage Crusaders. When Barton is not claiming that Thomas Jefferson was an Orthodox Christian or an abolitionist who definitely would have freed his slaves if it wasn't for those pesky 18th century Virginia laws, Barton is out to convince tens of thousands of Americans who follow him through his wildly popular books, videos, radio shows, appearances on the Glenn Beck Show program, that America indeed has a biblical heritage. Barton believes that virtually everything in the United States Constitution is based directly upon a biblical concept. For example, the framers' idea for 3 branches of government comes directly from Isaiah 33:22, where the prophet proclaims, "The Lord is our judge," judicial. The Lord is our Lord, lawgiver, legislative, and the Lord is our king, executive. You laugh, but people believe this guy. Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, which discusses the birth qualifications for the office of presidency. Barton argues this comes directly from Deuteronomy 17:15. "Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. One from among thy brethren shalt thus set king over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother." Believe it or not, followers of Barton invoke this passage over and over again during the great quote-unquote, Obama birth controversy as to whether or not he was an American-born citizen. And who knew that the tax-exempt status for clergy came directly from Ezra 7:24? You are also to know that you have no authority to impose taxes, tribute, or duty on any of the priests, Levites, singers, gatekeepers, temple servants, or other workers at this house of God. Now, scholars safely ensconced in their ivory towers in places like Cambridge, New Haven, Berkeley, and dare I say Durham, might dismiss Barton's ideas and balk at his influence. But anyone who spends time at a school board meeting, an evangelical megachurch, or a local gathering of the Republican Party or the Tea Party will come face to face with Barton's influence. Since my book came out, I have done probably close to 40 or 50 radio interviews on everything from Christian radio to conservative radio to sort of mainstream, secular talk radio. I have probably done just as many lectures in churches and in historical societies and so forth. And Barton's influence is real. People quote Barton all the time. I don't think I have ever done a public lecture in which someone has not asked me, what do you think about David Barton? In 2006, as some of you may know, Time magazine named Barton one of the 25 most influential evangelicals in America. And recently, he represented Texas on the committee that penned the Republican Party platform. And he claimed that 70 of his 71 motions in that committee made it into the final document. Now, usually I'm very suspect of what David Barton has to say, but actually I believe him on this particular thing when he says 70 of 71 of his motions made it in. Now, Barton's not the only biblical heritage crusader, if you want to call him that. There's a group called American Vision, which follows the Christian Reconstructionist thinker Rusas Rushdoony, who wants to bring back Old Testament law to the United States. There are Christian Reconstructionists, Christian homeschoolers who use Barton for their history classes, to teach history. There are Year of the Bible resolutions in states. My own state, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, issued a very, very partisan biblical heritage type based resolution. This kind of biblical heritage is very, very popular in the United States, particularly with those on the right and the Christian right. So yes, the study of America's biblical heritage is alive and well. But heritage is only one road of entry, if you will, into the past. What if we were to make an effort to approach the past, in this case, the role the Bible has played in American history, without the primary goal of promoting some kind of cultural and political agenda in the present? Now, if you really push me on that, I'd say that's probably impossible. We all come to the past with our own preconceived notions. But at least we should be striving to get the past right and not manipulate the past, in this case the history of the Bible in America, for our own purposes. So, what if we listen to the past on its own terms, rather than cherry-picking the things we find useful? What if we tried to avoid what historian Bernard Bailyn has called indoctrination by historical example? If we approach the past this way, we would find that the Bible has indeed played a powerful role in the collective life of this nation. I don't think anyone here or anywhere would deny that historical fact. But we would also find things that may not make the heritage crusaders very happy about the way the Bible has been used by Americans. We would be exchanging heritage for history, and we would thus have a more thorough picture of the role the Bible played in the American past. We might even be more cautious about how we use America's biblical past when we enter the public square. Now, of course, we cannot ignore the evidence. John Winthrop, we've heard about him, invoking Matthew 5:14, told the colonists of Massachusetts Bay that their settlement would be a city on a hill, a shining model of what a society might look like if it were built on the teachings of Scripture. But at the same time, let's not forget that Winthrop and his colleagues also used the Bible to persecute, and in a few cases even execute, anyone in the city on a hill who was unwilling to conform to orthodoxy with a capital O, or the Puritan understanding of the correct way to read the Bible. They capitalized the O. The Bible was used to promote the abolition of slavery, and it was used in the South to make a moral and theological defense of slavery. The Bible was employed on behalf of women's rights and civil rights, but it was also used as a basis for Jim Crow laws and the harsh treatment of Native American populations. The Bible has been a fixture of political campaigns, and here I would have a slight difference with Professor Berliner Blau. The Bible has been a fixture in political campaigns well before the rise of the Christian right, and whatever secularism the Democratic Party has recently abandoned, again, as we learned about last night, was only a blip on the timeline of a political party, as historian John McGreevy has shown us, that has long been shaped by the Catholic Church and its interpretation of the Bible. So again, let's take the long view here, and we see that politics is saturated. It's presidential elections even saturated with biblical language. Part of the explanation for these different uses of the Bible is that the United States has long been a predominantly Protestant country. Americans, more than any other nation in the world, has mastered the Protestant idea of putting the Bible in the hands of the people, letting them interpret it for themselves in their own language, and then applying it freely to any and all public issues. In the early 19th century, when this kind of Protestant individualism converged with American democracy, complete with its anti-authoritarian impulse, its commitment to political consumerism, and its celebration of religious liberty and religious disestablishment, the result was really a freewheeling approach to the Bible, or a freewheeling approach to biblical interpretation that contributed to some of our nation's brightest moments and some of our nation's darkest moments. So, with all this in mind, let me then turn specifically to my task, or at least my task as I understand it, this afternoon, namely the place of the Bible in the American founding. As we will see, much of what Professor Berliner Blau discussed last night about the role of the Bible in today's political rhetoric has a long history in American life. Now, let me first assert the fact that indeed the Bible played a prominent role in the American Revolution. You cannot ignore the role that the Bible played. The Bible is everywhere at the time of the American founding. There was a University of Houston political scientist named Donald Lutz who studied all the writings of the founding fathers. Now, I won't get into how he identified the so-called founding fathers. We can talk about that at Q&A or afterwards if you'd like. But he studied all of the published writings of the founding fathers. And what he found was that the Bible, more than any other text, was cited in the writings of these founders. Now, to be fair to the statistics, because Christian nationalists love to pull out that statistic. Hey, we have this University of Houston objective observer telling us that the Bible is the most cited book in the time of the American founding. However, to be fair to that evidence, if you were to add up all of the Whig or classical or Enlightenment texts that the founders cited, they would be cited twice as much as that of the Bible. So it all depends how you're going to sort of use your evidence. But nevertheless, Lutz shows that the Bible was indeed important. Indeed, 18th century American culture was saturated with the Bible. There was a high level of biblical literacy in the 18th century. The Puritans in New England, for example, had an over 80% literacy rate, making them probably the most literate society in the world at the time of the American Revolution. And much of that literacy came through the reading of the scriptures. Even those with lower literacy rates, or those religious traditions that do not necessarily celebrate a sort of bibliocentric faith, those Christian groups like the Anglicans, for example, who are much more interested in ritual, or Quakers, who turn to extra-biblical revelation, the inner light, to find revelation. Even these groups still upheld a very, very high place for the Bible in their theological systems and in their denominations and so forth. just read Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine, as many of you know, a skeptic, really had no use for traditional Christianity, as he would later write in his book, The Age of Reason. But I'm teaching Common Sense actually next week in my United States History Survey class. And every time I read it, I'm struck by just how much Paine used the Old Testament to make an argument against monarchy. And clearly, since this had such immense popularity, Common Sense, people understood that argument that Paine was making. Now, again, none of us would probably disagree with the fact that the 18th century was very much a Protestant culture in which the Bible was important. What fascinates me, however, as a historian, is how the Bible was used. The ways in which the Bible was used in the 18th century. And this is what I talk a little bit about in my book. Let me give you one example. One of the most popular verses, occasionally the founders themselves used this. It was largely used by patriotic ministers, those people who were normally the most only educated people in a particular 18th century community, who thus had a powerful role on the popular bottom-up resistance during the Revolution. One of the favorite verses they loved to cite was the New Testament verse of Galatians 5:1. Let me read you Galatians 5:1 from the King James. It says this: "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourself be burdened by a yoke of slavery." Now, I kept seeing this verse over and over again, so I did a little study of it. I tried to find sort of ancient and medieval and Protestant Reformation and Catholic commentaries on Galatians 5:1. And in most of those commentaries, again, there's some variation here and there, but let me try to give a sort of general summary of what, how this verse would have been interpreted. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. In other words, people need to be free from something. The verse says a yoke of slavery. That yoke of slavery normally has something to do with either sin, the sin nature. Some commentators, say Satan or the devil. There's something holding us away from God in this interpretation of Galatians 5:1. And Jesus Christ, through his death on the cross and his resurrection, has freed us from that sin nature or Satan or so forth. A pretty standard interpretation, again, that you can find in the history of the Christian church dating all the way back to Augustine. In 1769, there was a Presbyterian minister named Enoch Green. And Enoch Green preached a sermon from Galatians 5:1. And as you read his sermon notes, you'll see that Enoch Green pretty much preached a standard message about Galatians 5:1. Very similar to the way the historic Christian church has thought about Galatians 5:1, and very similar to the way that I just described the common interpretation of Galatians 5:1. 6 years later, in 1775, at the height of the Revolutionary conflict, Lexington and Concord has happened. Bunker Hill has happened. The Continental Congress is sitting in Philadelphia, making their plans for independence. Enoch Green got back into his pulpit, and he preached from Galatians 5:1 again. Now, I don't know if there's any pastors or ministers in the room, but I know some ministers, and when they preach on a passage again, they go into the filing cabinet and pull out the old Galatians 5:1 sermon, and hopefully no one remembers it from 6 years ago, right? Some of you div students out there, right? There's a tip. This is not what Enoch Green did. Instead, Enoch Green preached a completely different sermon on Galatians 5:1 with a completely different interpretation. In this new interpretation, the yoke of slavery, of course, was Parliament and their taxation schemes. The freedom was not religious freedom or freedom from sin, but political freedom from the tyranny of the British government. And Jesus Christ, or Christ, Enoch Green told his congregation, is really a metaphor for the New Jersey militia and the Continental Army, who will soon be setting you free from this yoke of slavery. Now, this may seem an outrageous interpretation of this text, but it is very, very, very common. I can point you to dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of times in which patriotic ministers interpret the Bible to fit the political climate of the day. This is nothing new in American history. Now, I always like to say this, I'm no biblical scholar, I'm not a theologian, I'm an American historian. So I don't claim to have any expertise to say whether or not Enoch Green interpreted that passage correctly or not. What I can tell you is that it's a very innovative interpretation based upon the way everyone else has interpreted it for the last thousand years or so. That's the best I can do in terms of my limited vocation as a historian. I'll let all of you theologians and biblical scholars deal with the, whether or not Enoch Green was legitimate in his interpretation. Or how about this sermon? Abraham Cateltus, preaching in Jamaica, Queens, New York, to a group of Dutch Calvinists and French Huguenots, preaches a sermon in 1777 called God's Arising and Pleading His People's Cause. The text comes from Psalm 74:22. Arise, O God, plead thine own cause. At least that's the part of the verse that he included in the sermon. The verse actually goes on to say other things too. 3 basic points Cateltus argued. One, he argued that based on this text, God always pleads the cause of his people. Fair enough. Point 2, the members of the British American colonies lived lives of righteousness, charity, love, integrity, and truth. And in addition to the fact that they have the providential blessing of God placed upon them, they qualify today as God's people. And then point 3 in the logic here, the British are providing a threat to God's people, and as we saw from point 1, God will always defend or plead the cause of God's people, so God must be supportive of the American Revolution. Now, listen to Cateltus' conclusion that he gets from this one little piece of Psalm 74. He says this, be therefore of good courage. It, meaning the revolution, is a glorious cause of truth against error and falsehood, the cause of righteousness against the oppressor, the cause of pure and undefiled religion against bigotry, superstition, and human inventions. The revolution is the cause of the Reformation against popery. There's the requisite anti-Catholicism of the founders. It is the cause of liberty against arbitrary power, of benevolence against barbarity, of virtue against vice. It is the cause of justice and integrity against bribery, venality, and corruption. In short, it is the cause of heaven against hell, of the kind of parent of the universe against the prince of darkness and destroyer of the human race. Why don't you tell us what you really think, Abraham Cateltus? But these are the kinds of, this is the kind of rhetoric that you see over and over and over again. I include much of it in my book, but there's so much more that's out there that I couldn't fit in the book. Now, what about the biblical literalists? These people seem to be taking a very kind of metaphorical interpretation to the Bible. Were there biblical literalists out there? Were there people that took the Bible at face value? Took maybe a common sense approach, like a modern day fundamentalist might take today to the Bible. Let me suggest to you that the biblical literalists happen to be the loyalists, the Anglican clergy, who believed that all of these interpretations that people like Abraham Cateltus and Enoch Green were throwing out there were wrong and faulty interpretations of the Bible. Professor Berliner Blau mentioned these verses last night, but let me repeat them. The 2 favorite verses of the loyalist clergy were Romans chapter 13 and 1 Peter 2. Let me read you some brief snippets. I won't read you the whole verse. It's 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17. First, let me read a quick part of Romans 13. It says this, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. Now listen to this in the context of an 18th century revolution, right? Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, the Apostle Paul says. For there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive themselves damnation. Then it goes on. For this cause pay ye tribute also. Taxes. Pay them. For they, the government, are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Or listen to 1 Peter 2, 13 through 17. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, for so is the will of God. As servants of God, honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, and what? Honor the king. Over and over and over again, you see these loyalist clergy. Many of them are on the run because the patriots have taken over their community and they're fleeing either to a safe haven in New York or they're on their way up to Nova Scotia. But while they're doing it, they're writing these sermons in which they are basically making these very straightforward biblical arguments about submission to authority. One of the leading Anglican clergymen was a man named Samuel Seabury. He's got a divinity school actually named, I think it's an Episcopal divinity school associated with Northwestern in Chicago. Here's what Seabury said in a sermon. He said this, and this was a sermon, by the way, in 1 Peter 2. Seabury said this, when St. Peter and St. Paul wrote their epistles, they were under the government of heathen emperors and magistrates who persecuted them and the other Christians, depriving them of their possessions, beating and banishing and killing them without any crime proved against them, but merely because they were Christians. And yet it was to these emperors and magistrates, even to Nero and Caligula, that the apostles commanded honor and respect at all times, and whenever it could be done consistently with obedience to God, duty, and submission. So, here is a clear sort of common sense approach to the Bible. Many of the patriots respond, oh no, Romans 13 can't apply to the revolution. After all, Britain is being so tyrannical towards us, taxing us, coercive acts, townshend duties, stamp acts. There's no way that Romans 13 could be applicable to this kind of a situation. And the Anglican clergy are saying, oh no, our reading of the Bible suggests that clearly God is telling us to submit to George III or any other authority for that matter. So, where does this leave us? Did the Bible play an important role in America during the Revolution? Of course it did. But perhaps Mark Knoll, the historian, put it best when he wrote, to be sure, patriotic ministers often applied biblical texts to support their cause. But now, after the passage of time, these efforts look more like comical propaganda than serious biblical exposition. Indeed, many clergy took great liberties with biblical passages in order to make them fit with the dominant political ideas of the day. Few patriot clergy offered deep theological reflection on the political climate in which they found themselves, settling instead for proof texting and innovative approaches to biblical interpretation fused with Lockean liberalism or Whig political thought. While we would be hard-pressed to say that the Anglican loyalist clergy were completely free of this kind of political motivation, and I don't want to give that impression, they seem to have remained true to a common-sense reading of the text, placing them in the rather odd position of speaking prophetically from the Bible in support of the status quo and against a revolution that they believed was conceived in sin. In the end, the use of the Bible in American politics dates back to the earliest days of the Republic. This was a history that our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, knew all too well. In March 1865, during his second inaugural address, Lincoln stood before a divided and broken nation, reeling from a bloody civil war, and made an effort to reflect on the war's meaning. Lincoln said that both North and South read the same Bible and prayed to the same God, and both invoke his aid against the other. With this in mind, Lincoln's only theological recourse, at least for him, his only theological recourse was to appeal to mystery, or as he said, the Almighty has his own purposes. In a political and public culture in which the Bible is still used to invoke God's aid against our enemies, and I should say used by those on both the left and the right to do so, perhaps we need a greater dose of Lincoln's humility. Perhaps the Almighty does indeed have his own purposes. Thank you.
Our second speaker for this session is Professor Shalom Goldman, and I'm delighted to introduce him. He's a colleague of mine in the Department of Religion here at Duke University. With an MA in Middle Eastern Studies and a doctorate in Hebrew and Biblical Studies, he considers himself a specialist in Middle Eastern religions. He is that, and much more, for he's also an astute observer and commentator on many aspects of civic and religious life, past and present, in the United States and Europe, as well as in the Middle East. This is quite clear from his role as a public intellectual, as a prolific contributor to many print and electronic publications, such as Religion Dispatches, Publishers Weekly, the Boston Globe, the Forward, and the Nation. His scholarly publications are equally timely and impressive. For example, his most recent book, Zeal for Zion, Christians, Jews, and the Idea of the Promised Land. This is a book which offers a highly original and important perspective on Zionism and the existence of the State of Israel. Zionism, as you probably know, is usually portrayed as a Jewish political movement, but Shalom opens up the whole issue, showing the significant role of Christian involvement, most recently by Christian evangelical Protestants, with Zionism. Professor Goldman also has a lively interest in many other things, including music, especially as it intersects with his other interests. He has been the librettist for several operas with biblical themes. He has been known to lecture on Johnny Cash in the Holy Land, Christian Zionism, and American popular culture. And today he will enlighten us on God's American Israel, the Bible, and the American imagination. Join me in welcoming Professor Shalom Goldman.
Thank you, Carol, for that very kind introduction. Can I be heard in the back of the room? Yes, great. So those students who know me, I haven't been here that long, know that I don't like technology. And I'm always lecturing about going back to talk and chalk. What do you do if the machine doesn't work? You have to speak to your students, have a conversation, and perhaps write on the board. But to quote the Bible, how the mighty have fallen. I too have fallen. And I am starting to use technology. And I thought for this audience, slides would be in order. I'm going to be speaking for the first half of my presentation from notes and somewhat extemporaneously, and then go to slides. But is this slide up there now? Not yet. Great. Okay, good. God's American Israel. This past Wednesday at the Democratic Convention in Charlotte, delegates voted to put God, or in any case the word God, back in the platform. They amended a notion about, quote, the government's role in helping people reach their God-given potential. This had been taken out of the platform. Some Republican pundits had noticed it, so God-given was put back. And on the same day, the party reinstated in the platform this line, quote, Jerusalem is and will remain the capital of Israel, a line that had been in the 2008 platform but had been taken out. Now, according to the New York Times on Thursday morning, President Obama personally intervened in the second matter, in the matter of Jerusalem being mentioned in the platform. And he insisted that the delegates put it back. And if you were at Professor Berliner-Blau's wonderful lecture last night, you heard that on the floor of the convention there was booing about this. People did not like, there were objections to putting this back, but it was put back in. It seems that the title of my talk, God's American Israel, might be taken from the Republican platform, or from the website of AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. What could be a stronger endorsement of the American connection with Israel? God's American Israel. But actually, the phrase is from a sermon by Ezra Stiles, pastor of the Congregational Church in Newport, Rhode Island, at the time of the American Revolution. In many sermons, he used this phrase to speak about the American Revolution. As we've heard in almost every lecture, the American Revolution was imagined as an event of biblical and mythic proportions. And the model for it was the freeing of the Israelites from the yoke of Egypt. It's a commonplace piece of knowledge that this was important in American history, but one of the values of what we're doing at this conference is seeing how this concept played out. George III of England was imagined as the Pharaoh, and in the promised land of the United States, the colonists would live out a life of God-fearing piety. Now, while this biblical trope was understood as a metaphor for the American Revolution, that metaphor exerted so much power, so much force, that in the minds of many Americans, it took on an odd reality. And I'll be giving you a couple of versions of this reality. For Ezra Stiles, the pastor in New England, who later became the president of Yale University, American identification with Israel meant that Americans had to learn the Hebrew language, and all college students had to study Hebrew. And in fact, at Yale and at each of the 10 colleges founded before the American Revolution, Hebrew was a mandatory subject. In fact, the students complained so loudly that by 20 years after the Revolution, Hebrew became the first elective. This was at Harvard. And when the students at Yale asked President Stiles, he was the president, but he insisted on teaching Hebrew, perhaps because no one else would. They asked him, well, Reverend Stiles, why do we need to study Hebrew in North America in 1795? And his answer was, young men, and of course it was only young men, when you get to heaven, that is the first language that you will hear, and I'm assured you are all going to heaven. And he didn't mention what the language of hell was, although there were many theories about that. Now, one of our speakers, yes, David Stowe this morning, mentioned Sack Van Berkovich and his wonderful book, American Jeremiad. And for those of you interested in this topic, I can't think of a book I would recommend more. And a short quote from Berkovich: nothing more clearly attests to the power of the American Puritan imagination than this mythico-historiography. The emigrants had fled England as from certain destruction. Behind them, they believed, lay the failure of European Protestantism, and before them, as their refuge, what they called the wilderness, the desert. Now, they were going to be a Christian Israel in the long-awaited new heaven and new earth. Well, we've heard a lot about the Puritans. What about other groups in the colonies and in the American Republic who identified with the Hebrews? One case that's come up in a couple of talks today were African Americans. In sermons, in songs, in lectures, and we read pieces of Frederick Douglass's lecture this morning, African Americans identified with ancient Israel. But now the oppressor was not George III of England, the oppressor was white America, from whom they would be freed by God's intervention. And as we move into the 19th century, in the 1830s and 40s, with the emergence of the Mormon Church, the experience of ancient Israel served as a template for the church's own history. When Mormon scripture and history emerged, it was written so as to directly connect the Mormon experience in the United States with the experience of the Israelites. How did the Mormon ancestors come to the United States? In fact, how did humans come to the United States? Judeans from Judea came by boat to the Americas. They were one large group, then they split into two warring groups, and from them came eventually a visit by Jesus to the American continent. This is all in the Mormon scripture. It is not a coincidence that the great national park in Utah is Zion National Park. That is, the idea of Zion in Mormonism has its most powerful expression. And that expression finds another type of expression, which is the essence of what I want to convey today, that in the early 1840s, before his death, the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith sends an emissary to Jerusalem. This was no small matter. He didn't send him to Newark Airport, right? He sent him to Jerusalem. It took him 3 months to get there. And the job of this emissary from the church was to bless the holy city and to pray for the return of the Jews. And those of you who know Jerusalem know that you can visit this spot today. It's under what's now the LDS campus in Jerusalem. Based on this American-Hebrew connection, my contention is, and this is the case I made in my book, Zeal for Zion, that the American connection, interest, obsession with the modern state of Israel cannot be understood without a deep knowledge of this religious background. And here I am arguing forcefully with a very popular book. As we say back in Brooklyn, oh, if only my book would sell like this book. But the book is by Mearsheimer and Walt, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. Now, I do not disagree with the contention of this book, that American foreign policy should be heatedly debated and perhaps support of Israel is not in American interest. I do not disagree with that. And I'll probably lose my synagogue membership for it. But what I disagree with is the approach that the authors take to explaining to the American public why Americans either favor Israel or if they don't favor Israel, they are so exercised about it that they can't give attention to much else. This is what Walt and Mearsheimer have to say in the opening pages of their book. The United States has played an important and steadily increasing role in Middle East security since World War II, driven initially by oil, then by anti-communism, and over time by its growing relationship with Israel. And then the authors go on to document this, especially about oil and the Cold War. Back to the authors. Given this dramatic transformation in America's role in the region, it makes little sense to try to explain current US policy, and especially the lavish support that is now given to Israel by referring to the religious beliefs of a bygone era, or the radically different forms of past American engagement. There was nothing inevitable or predetermined about the current special relationship between the United States and Israel. Let me read that again. There was nothing inevitable or predetermined about the current special relationship between the US and Israel. My research and the research of many other scholars, among them scholars in the room, has shown that this is a baseless claim. Israel was inevitable for America. My contention is that Israel didn't come into being in some other way. The United States would have had to invent it. Israel must exist as a sign of the success of the United States and of the sign that there are really two Holy Lands. And I don't know if Professor Berliner-Blau caught this, but a few months ago on an Alabama radio station, Mitt Romney was interviewed by a very cagey interviewer, and the interviewer said, tell me, what is the real Holy Land? Israel or America? So Romney didn't answer, and then a third time during the interview, Romney said, let's talk about health care. The third time that this came up, Romney said, well, we'll have to ask the church, but I would guess it's Israel. Now, I would guess that Mr. Romney, who was an official in the church and a very highly educated man, knows that the Mormon church has a dual Holy Land idea. There are two Holy Lands. One is here and one is there. Now, am I saying that all American ideas about Israel proceed from Mormonism? No. But I'm saying, along with Harold Bloom, the Yale literary critic, that Mormonism is the most American of religions. It can teach us a lot about American ideas. And I contend that Israel is a kind of holy land or horrible land for Americans. What of Americans who don't like Israel? And there are quite a few. I'm thinking of Chris Hedges' very passionate declaration of independence from the state of Israel. Mr. Hedges, who's a wonderful writer, finds it difficult to write about anything else because he's obsessed with this issue. Why is America so connected to the Holy Land? Now, these relationships between Israel and America reflect American religious behavior. Now, for my colleagues in the room, religious behavior will be an elusive term. So what do I mean? I mean, who goes to church or synagogue or mosque? In the United States, 40% of people go to church or house of worship every week. 80% of evangelicals. This is the country in the West where people worship. People read the Bible. People hear biblical ideas. Let me give you a statistic from Israel. 20% of Israeli Jews go, so half the number of people that go in America go to synagogue every week, and 20% told a pollster 2 years ago that they would never go to synagogue. 15% of American Jews go to the synagogue every week, as opposed to 80% of evangelicals. That is to say that the religious attachment to Israel in a Christian country is mediated by religion. People understand Israel to be a biblical nation. And I'm reminded of the story of President Eisenhower. I read this in an archive at the Ben Gurion Center in Israel. John Foster Dulles told, who was the Secretary of State of President Eisenhower, told this interviewer that the first few times, this would be in the 1950s, 52, 53, that Eisenhower had to meet David Ben Gurion, the founder of Israel. He would knock on the Secretary of State's door and he would say, "Where are the Israelites?" Not where are the Israelis, not where is the leader of Israel, but where are the Israelites? And Dulles would say, "Mr. President, we call them the Israelis." And Ike, who, like Romney, a very intelligent, successful man, said, "No, I prefer to think of them as the Israelites of the Bible." Right? This is the President of the United States, long before the rise of the right. What might you ask of American Jews? I've been speaking of American Christians, although I did chastise my co-religionists for not going to the synagogue. But aren't they part of this story? And my answer would be no. At the time of the American Revolution and in the first formative century, in what we've heard in this conference about how the American ideal and identification with Israel takes place, there are very few Jews here. In fact, there are 3 million people here at the time of the Revolution, including the vestiges of the Native Americans, African slaves, British colonists. There are fewer than 1,000 Jews. And in the next century, from 1776 to 1886, Jews had very little to do with public life and with the formation of the American idea. That would happen later. So we are speaking of a Hebrew component of the American consciousness, not of a Jewish component. I would like to illustrate this Jewish component, this Hebrew component, by a series of slides in which we see the metaphor of the Promised Land as understood by generations of Christians expressed. Now, what happens, and I want to forefront this because I'm going to get to this in the slides, is that after 2 centuries of having a metaphor expressed, in the minds of many Americans, that metaphor becomes a reality. That is, the metaphor is that America is Israel. The metaphor is that we're God's country, we're the Promised Land. The reality is that in 1948, there's actually a place that you can take a plane to, or a boat to, that is called Israel. When a metaphor becomes a reality, very strange things happen. Very odd things. So let us proceed with some illustrations of those things. Okay. what you see before you is from 1652, and this is a slide of the Hebrew exercises of the people who came over on the Mayflower. So two of the leaders of the Mayflower, Brewster and Bradford, on their journey would copy out sections of the Hebrew Bible, and then they would write the English translation on the bottom. And many people, and we spoke about the high literacy among these early American groups, many people engaged in this. Then in Plymouth Plantation and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Hebrew was a regular part of Sunday school instruction. So you had hundreds of people studying Hebrew. In fact, you had Hebrew school in America long before you had any Hebrews or Jews. Right? Something often forgotten. Now, for most Americans, a way to relate the Bible to America is by place names. So if you look in the eastern United States, you'll see scores of place names. Similarly, if you look in this part of the country, in fact, if you drove here, you probably passed by Mount Moriah Road a few times, Mount Zion Road. And this extends into the west also. There are fewer such places, but there are thousands of biblical names here. Now, one would think that much of this Hebraic identification would be done in the English language, but what I was amazed to find was that the founders of the 10 American colleges, and I mentioned that at every American college, Hebrew was taught, insisted that their students learn Hebrew. I mentioned that Professor Stiles wanted his men to get into heaven. Other teachers had a more practical approach. They said, well, students are studying Greek and Latin, which, if you think you have uninteresting courses now, at Duke I know you don't, but everyone had to learn Greek and Latin, and in the 10 colleges you had to learn Hebrew. So I was very pleased to discover in the Dartmouth archives this speech in Hebrew given in 1799 on commencement day. First, the speech was given in Greek, then in Latin, then in Hebrew. By the way, I don't think anyone in the audience understood these speeches, right? Including the students who were taking the class, but the professor who gave them understood them, and the faculty, trustees, and clergy were impressed that people were studying the ancient languages. This might be more familiar to you. If you have any connection to Yale, you'll notice the Yale insignia on the top. Now today, I know the Yale Hillel has this on their t-shirts, and I was sorry to disappoint them at a talk there to tell them that there were no Jews at all at Yale when this was put on the insignia, right? None. In fact, no Jews could go to Yale, right? At all. So why is this on the Yale t-shirt? Urim v'tumim, light and truth. Actually, it's a riposte, an answer to the Harvard, not yet t-shirt, but the Harvard emblem of light and truth. So at Yale, they were going to preserve the great tradition and not write in Latin, but write in Hebrew. And these are not my speculations. These are things that my colleague Dan Oren found and published in his great book, Joining the Club, about Jews at Yale. Okay, good. So I can't let a presentation about the American connection to the idea of Israel go by without presenting my hero from the 19th century, Professor George Bush. This man was the professor of Hebrew at New York University in 1850. He was a great polymath. He taught Greek, Latin, but primarily Hebrew, and he was a very popular writer. And we heard this morning from Professor Morgan about the Harper Brothers books. So in the 1840s, Harper Brothers published his commentaries on the Bible, and then in 1845, they published the first American book about Islam, called Muhammad the Impostor. So evangelical anti-Islamic sentiment is very old in this country, and it's often linked to the study of the Bible. I suggest that you look at the career of Professor George Bush to see what happens to a professor who gets too involved in his work and gives in to mystical transport. Because Professor Bush one day walked out of his office at NYU, locked the door, walked to Brooklyn, which you could in those days, and became head of the Swedenborg mystical community, and never wrote another word. But in the 20 years or so he taught, he made a great contribution to the study of Hebrew and foreign languages. And this next gentleman, another hero of mine, is Professor Calvin Stowe, the husband of the little lady who started the big war, Harriet Beecher Stowe. He was the professor of Hebrew at Bowdoin College at the time of the Civil War. And in Mrs. Stowe's memoirs, she says how she outlived him, how I miss my little rabbi. He would sit and read the Hebrew Psalms, and you'll notice that he has a head covering, right? So he was one of the trend among American Protestants of what we would now call Judaizing. That is, you want to be so much like the figures in the Old Testament that you start to read in Hebrew, you teach Hebrew, and you cover your head appropriately. Now, this innocuous and boring-looking manual Hebrew grammar is the key to the Mormon connection to Hebraism and to the Holy Land. When Joseph Smith was forming his new community, he wanted the elders to study the Bible in the original, but he couldn't find anyone, he was then in Ohio, to teach Hebrew. He heard of a Jewish teacher who wrote a book about Hebrew, and he brought that person to Ohio to set up a Hebrew school. And in that Hebrew school, Joseph Smith and his followers acquired the vocabulary that became integral to Mormon thought. I'll give you one example. From Ohio, they went to Nauvoo, Illinois, a very strange name. That's from the book of Isaiah, and it means beautiful, Mana'avu. Right? The Mormon vocabulary is full of these, and it seems Satius also cemented Joseph Smith's interest in the Jews returning to the Holy Land. I'll skip, yes, I'm going to wind up. I go now to the cover of Mark Twain's wonderful book, Innocents Abroad, in which he says, the word Palestine always brought to my mind a vague suggestion of a country as large as the United States. I do not know why, but such was the case. I suppose it was because I could not conceive of a small country having so large a history. Against this background of the American connection to Hebrew, the Bible, and the idea of Israel, I want to move to my conclusion, in which I show that the response from the side of the State of Israel very early on recognized the power of this American idea long before American scholars and academicians. So my journey into technology slowed me down a bit, but allow me to read this last piece and a quote. So to return to my opening remarks about the Republican and Democratic platforms, it is not only Republicans and Democrats who are concerned about putting Jerusalem, God, and the centrality of the Hebraic experience into their platforms. The political leadership of the State of Israel has recognized the power that these biblically referenced ideas have in the United States, and much less so in Europe. That Israel's leaders recognize the power of Israel's claims on the imagination of the Western world became very clear when Ehud Barak, now defense minister, was the prime minister of Israel, and he spoke at the United Nations Millennium Summit in 2000. He said, I believe that the very words Temple Mount in every Western language carry the real story of the place. This was at an era when the Temple Mount was in the headlines all the time. Barak went on to say, when we think of Jesus walking in the streets of Jerusalem, what he saw there was not a mosque, nor even a Christian church. What he saw was the temple, the second temple of the Jews, close quote. Barak, military hero, defense minister, and exemplar of Israeli secularism, was ideologically distant from anyone who would want the temple rebuilt. And it may have struck some in his UN audiences strange that the Israeli prime minister was invoking the name of Jesus. But like all Israeli leaders from Ben-Gurion onward, Barak recognized the power exerted by ancient images and ideas on the religious and political imaginations of Christians in America. Thank you very much.
We're happy now to turn this over to all of you, or whoever of you gets your hand up and gets this microphone, to ask a question of either or both of our speakers this afternoon, or to in some other way further the conversation.
This is not exactly on point to your basic topic, but since you mentioned it, I thought I might expand a little bit on that statistic you gave of 20% of synagogue goers in Israel versus 40% in the United States. Unlike the United States, Israel does not have a wide range of Orthodox, liberal to Orthodoxy in its synagogues. It's mostly Orthodox. And so people who might attend a more liberal service are sort of cut out. And it's because of historic reasons that it's not necessary to go into. But additionally, since the Orthodox are the basic synagogue goers in Israel, it's not the custom for women in many instances to go to services. And so that 20% is mostly the men. So it probably is actually closer to 40% of the American population that you mentioned. And I just thought I might mention that to sort of augment what it was that you had mentioned.
Okay, thank you for your comment. I guess we can't really know unless there's polling and very careful work. But you remind me, your comment about the hegemony of Orthodoxy in Israel reminds me of the quip one always hears from secular Israelis, that the synagogue I don't go to must be Orthodox, right? So it's not only that Orthodoxy reigns, but that in the minds of secular Jews, Orthodoxy reigns. Right? So it's a very complex issue. But thank you for your point.
Thank you both for your talk. Dr. B, I guess this is a question particularly for you, though both could address. So looking at the historiography of American religion, it seems that at times people are tempted to say authority is different now, that people have more access to publication, things like the internet allows distribution of different kinds of voices that maybe couldn't be heard. As a historian, I mean, I'm inclined to disagree, that nothing new's under the sun. There's always been people writing these kind of alternative histories. But in your own research and in your experience, have you found a difference? Is anything new under the sun? Does the internet or other things provide people like David Barton a larger voice than they would have in the past? And is that a problem or a blessing or both?
Well, that's a huge question. Let me take a stab at it. Yes and no, in terms of is there anything new under the sun. I mean, certainly you can point to all kinds of 18th century, 19th century examples of people engaging in the public sphere through print. You could make an argument that an 18th century almanac is a kind of blog or Facebook or Twitter feed, in the way that they provide these sort of pithy little comments on 18th century life. So in some ways, there's nothing. I don't think there's always ways of sort of effectively communicating in print and in reaching public audiences, whether it be penny newspapers and so forth. But certainly, I think the internet is something complete. I mean, it's way outside of my. I think Jacques mentioned the idea of pay grade last night. I live in the 18th century. I tell my students that anything after 1800 to me is current events. So anything I speculate on about the internet, would be mere speculation. But certainly it opens up people, whether it be Christian nationalists, whether it be secularists, it certainly opens up the conversation to a much greater extent than it could have been in the 18th or 19th centuries.
I just have a question. You were talking about how early in the revolution there was just a small population of Jews in America. but how do you think that those Jewish people in America would have reacted to like all the biblical references and just like, I don't know, the conversation through the eyes of the Bible about the war? Like, what would they have said about that?
Yes, thank you for asking. Although I said there were only about 1,000 Jews in the American colonies, there were a couple of Jewish leaders, and there was a large synagogue, and there were synagogues in South Carolina, New York, and Philadelphia, and their leadership did address issues of the revolution. As far as I know, most of these rabbis supported the revolution, but not all. And the most famous is a man named Seixas, S-E-I-X-A-S, of New York City. And he was a trustee of what was King's College and became Columbia University. And he wrote about the revolution in a very enthusiastic way, using his own biblical references. This gets more complex at the time of the American Civil War, when there are rabbis in the United States, many, and mostly Reform congregations. And then the congregations split geographically depending on where they are in the country, just as with the Christian churches.
I have a question for Professor Goldman. You spoke mostly about a period in which there weren't many Jews in the United States. Has your research uncovered evidence for a shift among the Christian communities in their attitude towards the Hebrew language once Jews started immigrating to the United States in large numbers, particularly in the early part of the 20th century?
Okay, well, Ben, thank you. You raise, I see you raising two things. There's a scholar named Igal Feldman who wrote a very persuasive book saying that the background I gave about Hebrew, Harriet Beecher Stowe's husband, Professor Bush, the Yale symbol, that all of these made the assimilation or acculturation of Jews in America easier than in other countries. I'm not totally convinced of that, but I do want you to know there's such a body of theory out there. Now, closer to home, for those of us who are biblical scholars, a curious thing happened, that American Jews had to battle their way into the academy, especially into the academy in terms of teaching the Bible. And this is not a long time ago. This is in the 50s, the 60s. And I was hired at Dartmouth. I was the token Jew in the Bible. Everyone who taught before me was a good Protestant and probably signed the Westminster Confession, and I couldn't. So what happened was two different kinds of Hebrew developed, and Arnold Band has written a wonderful article about this called Divinity School Hebrew and Modern Hebrew, how the tradition of teaching Hebrew in divinity schools kept on its own path, and then modern Hebrew influenced Hebrew in biblical studies. This is a very rich topic that I can refer you, there's a bibliography on this topic. But thank you for bringing it up, especially in terms of the first point, because it speaks to the question of acculturation of minorities in America. And that's the question we're dealing with now. Who gets in? All this feeling about immigration, all the Islamophobia, all the anxiety about the world out there wanting to come to America. And the question is, well, what template works? Who gets accepted and who doesn't? And I'm sure my colleagues have something to say about that.
I wanted to thank you both for your lectures today. There's quite a few dozen of us divinity school students who just read Professor Fia's book for our American Christianity class.
Thank you.
Thank you. And it was awesome.
Somebody's reading it.
Yeah. And I wanted to, I guess this question goes for both of you. There's a lot of young, up-and-coming pastors in this room who are charged with help educating people on this question. Was America founded as a Christian nation? So I guess my question is more urging for advice. How do we go out and faithfully teach people in the public about this question, and honestly to be respectful about our history? What kind of advice do you have for us as we go out to the church?
Well, I think first of all, you will encounter this. I've talked to a variety of different, mostly Christian, mainline Protestant pastors and others who are trying to create, certain forms of ecumenism within their community and bringing evangelical churches into the mix. And this is a real sticking point. I mean, I've literally had pastors tell me that, they wanted to have some kind of a joint service with the local megachurch in town, but the pastor said, "What's your view on David Barton's?" So this stuff is really out there. I think first and foremost, it would seem to me that your responsibility as a pastor is, Christian formation, bringing your congregation closer to God, however you want to talk about that. My big gripe, and I've spoken at a lot of evangelical churches and a lot of Protestant mainline churches. Actually, the Protestant mainline churches like me to come because they think I'm going to, they know I'm going to talk, critically about the Christian nationalist view. So the evangelical churches usually aren't quite sure what to make of me. But I think one of the problems, I could speak only here to Protestant churches, is that there is not a space in a lot of Protestant churches for this kind of conversation, whether it be about history, whether it be about politics, whether it be about humanities-based subjects or social science-based subjects. We think a lot about, Protestant churches think a lot about, injustice. They think a lot about sort of these kinds of social issues, but it's all in terms of activism and not a lot in terms of, thinking deeply about what causes injustice or, thinking deeply about, how to really think about the relationship of our founding to contemporary political life. Maybe an adult forum or something on a Sunday morning, once a month or something to that effect. I think churches, and both evangelical, Protestant churches, can encourage this kind of conversation in a sort of civil, Christian kind of manner. And very few of the churches are doing it. Are not doing it. I understand why they're not doing it, because it's not their primary mission. But at the same time, I would encourage all future pastors to create that kind of space where these kinds of, I go into mainline Protestant churches and evangelical churches and teach a Sunday school class, and it's just amazing to see, how many people are eating. They're eating this stuff up. They want to know more. They want to know how to engage culture. They want to know how to, think about history in a responsible way. So create that space. Don't make it the primary, space, but create that space where these kinds of conversations can take place and where this kind of education can happen. Especially if you're an evangelical out there, resist the sort of, as Mark Knoll called, the sort of scandal of the evangelical mind, the anti-intellectualism that does not seem to want to engage with these kinds of issues.
Dr. Fia, we heard last night about the difference between the use of Bible for policy versus for rhetorical device.
Right.
Can you speak to that dichotomy with regard to the Founding Fathers? You mentioned how much they used the Bible and how much they used Enlightenment, et cetera, thinking.
It's obviously hard to say. We only, as a historian, obviously I mentioned this before, my vocation is somewhat limited. I often tell my students that they have to approach the past with a certain degree of humility because we actually don't know what, when Thomas Jefferson quotes the Bible, we don't know what he was thinking, kind of thing. We can't interview him or we can't try to nail him down like the Alabama radio station did to Mitt Romney. So we're limited in that sense. However, I think it's clear that the Bible is used by many of the founders, at least. Now, again, I spent a lot of time in my talk talking about clergy. But when the founders use the Bible, they are clearly not, when they promote biblical ideas and so forth, they're normally promoting it for some type of sort of morality, common morality, civic virtue, if you will. Small r republicanism, the idea of sacrificing one's own interests for the greater good. And if the Bible can help them achieve that, then they will use it. They are not interested in citing the Bible. None of the founders cite the Bible for the purpose of drawing people closer to God or getting people to heaven. That's not what they were. They were statesmen. So what they did firmly believe that biblical ideas, particularly the Sermon on the Mount and some of the more moral teachings, this goes back to David Morgan's point about the Jefferson Bible, snipping out the supernatural for the moral teachings of Jesus. Those kinds of things were very, very valuable to them. And when they used them in public, they were they knew from taking History 101 in college, one of those 10 colleges, that republics fail when people are unwilling to sacrifice their own interests for the greater good. I think, I'm getting off tangent here, but listening to Barack Obama over and over again, especially last week, I mean, he is tapping into this kind of civic humanism, right? He ends the speech with Springsteen, "We take care of our own," cranking over the loudspeaker. I mean, that kind of using the Bible in a subordination in some ways to the good of the nation state. Certainly from the tradition that my school comes from, Messiah College, which is an Anabaptist Mennonite, sort of school, that's horrific. That's scandalous, because the Bible's supposed to speak prophetically to the culture. Stanley Hauerwas in the house here, right? It's these kinds of so. I don't know, when they use the Bible, if they're seriously, I think Jacques mentioned last night, he believes Barack. He believes that there's some kind of, and I do too, that there's some kind of serious spirituality here, But in terms of using the Bible for anything other than propping up the nation state, not at all. I mean, in fact, I'd agree with Jacques last night. I think Barack Obama uses the Bible more than any of the founders used the Bible. I mean, I just spent an entire several years studying the religious ideas of the founders. I can't pull out, there's no reference. George Washington mentions Jesus Christ once. And as a historian, I'm like, man, just give me some more here. I want to understand your religious worldview. Very rarely any mention. I wrote an op-ed on the religion website Pathos back in January, suggesting that Barack Obama may be the most, in his rhetoric at least, may be the most explicitly Christian president in American history. Well, Glenn Beck had a field day with it. I had conservatives calling up Messiah College asking for my firing. The human resources was getting calls and so forth, simply because I made this suggestion. But there was the tension, right, between the Christian right interpreting what I said as, he's not biblical, he's pro-choice, or something to that effect, versus my trying to show that indeed he's using this language to sort of promote the kind of republic, the kind of American society that he wants to try to create, which again, I think is very, very fitting with the way the founders used the Bible for their Republican experiment, if you will.
I know that we're eating into coffee time, but we had so little time to discuss this morning that I'm going to take the executive decision to take 2 more questions, and then we can continue this discussion over a break. So I know that you asked.
Thank you both for your lectures. I had a question regarding the relationship between 2 features that we've heard today of 18th century history. And on the one hand, we heard of the way that the 18th century, often Protestant ministers, understood America as a kind of iteration of Israel, this sort of parallel Holy Land. And then on the other hand, we also heard and know of African-American slave traditions of reinterpreting their story in the light of Israel's story. And I'm curious, is there a body of literature that would show us the way that these 2 conversations were talking to each other at that time? So would American Protestant ministers have been aware of the conversation in the way that sort of the same stories that they're laying claim to are also being contested or turned against them in certain ways? Is that a conversation that's happening, and do we have access to that in the historical research?
If it is happening, and I don't know if it's happening, but that's a very good research question. I mean, if you have, are you working on a master's thesis or something? That would be a very good topic. If it is happening, it's certainly not happening in the 17th or the 18th century. It may be happening with the sort of legacy of the Puritans in this sort of New England hotbed of abolitionism that people like Frederick Douglass are fleeing to, and slaves are freeing to. But that's just the total That's just a total guess. I don't know of any. I don't know of any.
Are you asking if in the 18th century this came up, or is there scholarship about this question? Right. I don't know, but that's not my period. But I know I just finished David Lewis's magnificent 2-volume biography of W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois takes this up. He's aware of these two conflicting. Of course, that's a century and a half later.
Okay.
But you might track through there to see, if is someone else going on. Is this conversation going on elsewhere?
If I could just add one more thing to your talk, Shalom, about, and many of the talks today about, we're hearing a lot about Sackvan Berkovich. We're hearing about, the Jeremiah, or the errand into the wilderness, the city on a hill, and so forth. There is a, certainly, yes, there is this sort of Hebrew component to all of that. But we have, and now I'm speaking completely as a sort of early American historian here. How accurate is it to, I've been bothered a little bit with how accurate is it to sort of portray America as New England writ large. The people who I spend a lot of time with, Quakers in Pennsylvania, Anglicans in Virginia, Presbyterians in Virginia with Scots-Irish background. None of these people are embracing that New England city on a hill model, which means the sort of Hebrew kind of language that they're using. Now, certainly the place names, right? I can't argue with that. But the Hebrew language that they're using, the sort of Aaron city on a hill, that's not present in these people. So if we're looking at America as New England writ large, like Berkovich or Andrew Delbanco rather, and some of these others want us to do, then I think you're absolutely right. I'm just wondering how much that is a dominant paradigm for understanding particularly here I'm talking about the American Revolution more than anything else. Yes. I don't see fighting Quakers, for example, like Betsy Ross in Philadelphia, drawing upon the New Israel paradigm, or pro-Anglican, pro-revolutionary Anglicans or Scots-Irish Presbyterians drawing upon this Hebrew. Not that it's not there, not that it's not prevalent, but it is very much a New England phenomenon. And now I'm going to come across, I'm an early American history geek who lives in this world.
Right.
So,
No,
yeah.
and I want to concede to your geekdom. I totally do. And I mean, when I wrote a book on this subject in 2004, and it was well received, but there were historians who got on my case about writing New England large, and I do admit to being influenced by Berkovich.
Yeah.
And now, how could you not be influenced by a man named Sackvan? His parents named him for the Sacco and Vanzetti case.
That's right.
Right? So, coming from Red Diaper, New York, you're going to kind of drink this stuff up. But I do mean to write a piece about the American South in Hebrew.
I'd be interested
That's
in
very
that. Yeah.
strong in the American South.
Okay.
But I can't speak to Quakers as of yet.
Well, first of all, Quakers weren't supporting the revolution. They're only a small percent. But, you could make an argument, right, that the city on a hill is, or the errand into the wilderness of New England is writ large if you go to Reagan and all these people who are constantly invoking it, right?
Yes.
Maybe it has become that.
Yes, and let's not forget Reagan is the president who used another Hebrew phrase, Armageddon, in reference to world events, right? So, City on the Hill and Armageddon, it's a very compelling pair.
Very interesting, yeah.
One more from back here.
Thank you. I understand if people need to leave. I had a question mostly for Dr. Goldman. I was curious about your description of Israel in a mythological mindset in America, and I was wondering if, in light of especially recent environmental degradation and the popular conception of troubles in the world today, if there's a really fundamental idea about Israel as being something that people can grab onto in a very mythological way of being, a golden world kind of place, and if that's very different from how it was maybe 200 years ago. Does that make sense?
Well, let me say, I think Americans have a view of the Middle East, not only of Israel, that's biblically influenced. So the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, now with us for 10 years, are understood by many Americans as biblical wars. Saddam speak about Babylon, which we heard about this morning. Saddam from Babylon was the evil empire. 9/11, we've heard about it, you know, we all know about the religious ideas surrounding what happened. So trouble starts from the Middle East. And what is the best-selling book in the United States in terms of a set, Left Behind? 70 million copies last time I looked. That doesn't mean that 70 million people or all the readers believe it, but they read it. And if you slough through the 12 books, you'll find out that Israel is the center of everything. It's where the world begins and where the world ends. And as Jerry Falwell said, if you want to know what the clock of history is doing, watch Israel. And now that's a quote. And then to paraphrase, in 1948, when I was a young man, I think the clock had stopped. But then Israel came and it started ticking. This is from, you can look in this, Merrilee Simon's long interview book with Jerry Falwell. So this is a very deeply held idea. So I concede to my colleague that maybe I'm making too much of this in 18th century America. But in 20th century America, it'd be very hard to make too much of this idea.